Hello everyone, welcome to this week's news and community spotlight. We're kicking off the news for this week with the latest hotfix update for Unreal Engine 5.4.3. This update includes over a dozen fixes ranging from performance acceleration to crash mitigation to lightening the load on GPU. As is the same with any update to the engine, make sure to take a moment to read through the latest notes and let us know about any feedback or bugs you may have or have experienced. This way, we can further improve and build on the engine together. You can do so under the main 5.4 announcement post on our forums at dev.epicgames.com/community. Rain or shine, winter or summer, we've got free assets for you to explore each month, including everything from VFX and environments to characters and gameplay systems. Here's what the lineup is for this July. Mediterranean Coast by Mithratech is a spectacular environment pack with everything you need to transport players across the world, with lush forests, imposing sea cliffs, and sweeping sandy bays. It comes with 5 spawners for procedurally generating large rock formations, cliffs, olive trees, pine trees, and stones, as well as a landscape paint layer that can be used to quickly and easily paint areas to populate with procedural foliage. Set up AI and player characters the easy way with Ultimate Character by Vahid. This comprehensive pack of more than 250 blueprints includes a variety of attack types from weapons to magic, together with item inventories, dynamic cameras for attacking, blocking, and locking on target, a pickup and/or drops item system, and more. Use a simple table system to set everything up. No programming required. The huge Mega Magic VFX bundle by VR Rhino FX will have you under its spell, with 61 bewitching effects that include magic auras, shields, and explosions, comprising 38 master materials, 124 material instances, 18 textures, and 3 unique meshes. Everything has been fully optimized for ease of use. Customize anything you wish using the adjustable parameters to make them your own. Create a variety of beautiful low-poly landscapes with this 5-biome stylized landscape bundle by Orasat. From vibrant forests and grassy savannas to desert canyons and fertile oases, there's a whole range of terrains to explore, each packed with options for trees, rocks, bushes, rivers, foliage, and more. In the business of creating virtual worlds, you won't want to miss this. The World Director NPC Pro plugin by Craft Asset Studios enables you to simultaneously create and manage thousands of pawns in a game, simulate entire cities or even entire worlds of NPCs going about their virtual lives. Remember to grab this month's content fast. It's only free until the end of July. And don't forget, you can always see the latest featured free marketplace offerings on the Unreal Engine sponsored content page. Let's take a look at the spotlights for this week. Dusktide by Kareem Yasser is a stunning scene overlooking the remnants of a creative mix between sci-fi and rough nature. They created what you see before you with a combination of Kitbash assets and Quixel megascans, finishing off the final detail work with a custom fog workflow combining methods from several different aspects. Part of the creation process was documented on their main post, so if you're interested in learning more or seeing more of their work, you can do so at their ArtStation. The Ancient Library by Tristan Cheselet is a beautiful snow-capped environment that shows off a project originally started as a mentorship scene that was finished later with even greater prowess. Everything you see, except for the foliage and weather effect, was handcrafted by the artists themselves, casting a very personal touch to the finalized project before you. There are tons of angles and assets to behold in this project, so don't be afraid to go check it out on their ArtStation. Wing and Hussar White was both concepted and rendered by Emre Ekmekci. This insanely detailed and well-crafted character has a tremendous amount of inherent storytelling all the way from its plumaged head to its travel-worn feet to its esteemed steed. There are truly not enough words that could be said to stress the sheer amount of talent and detail work to find here in this project, so we recommend taking some time to go check out the main post for yourself to give it the love and attention it deserves. Not only that, but if you enjoyed this character, we also recommend you check out the other color variants concepted by Emery as well. You can do all of this and see some of their other work over at their ArtStation. That's it for today's news and community spotlights. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Inside Unreal, a weekly show where we learn, explore, and celebrate everything Unreal. I'm your host, Tina, and today with me, I have Dan. Welcome back, Dan.
Welcome
Who
back,
are you?
everybody.
Who
We
are
are.
you, Dan? For
Who am
anyone who
I?
might not be familiar. Yes.
Oh man, I'm still figuring that out myself, if I'm honest. No, I'm Dan Hutnick. I am an environment artist, and I am the live stream operator here for the community streams we do for Unreal and Fortnite and all that stuff. And yeah, we're here to talk about some cool stuff.
Yep. We're here to do things and talk about things and be here. So welcome.
Yes, yes. We've got the present part, so I
Yeah.
mean,
We're meeting the bare minimum
we're
requirements
currently at
thus far.
100% based off of all goals. So
But yes, welcome back, everybody. Obviously, it's been a few weeks now. There was a quick little summer break that we had there that was epic wide. It was good to have short little vacay. Sounds like from chat, a few of you are also on vacation right now. So hope you're enjoying that. Thanks for being here. While you're on your vacation, I'm going to take that as a compliment. But welcome back. I did want to address something super quickly because obviously, anyone who may have noticed the schedule for the streams today, according to the top of the page here, we're going to be talking about collision and avoiding common collision mistakes. That was not the original plan. So you're not going crazy. uh, we're also not gaslighting you. There
I,
was going to be a stream today about 5.4 animation and rigging updates, and that stream is still going to happen. Just unfortunately, one of our guests had a bit of an emergency today and wouldn't be able to make it. So instead, we're rescheduling that to a few weeks from now. I'll make sure I let you all know when that's going to actually happen. It should be somewhere around like the end of August, but it is going to happen. We're still going to be covering all that really cool, great content. Just want to make sure that y'all have that update so you're not like, wait a second.
I
This isn't
feel
what was supposed to happen.
it's too late now to do this, but I feel like we should have done a stream on pivots, considering how we had to pivot from the previous stream to this one quite rapidly.
Yes, exactly. Awesome. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about collisions instead, going to be talking about some optimal settings for collisions because it is unfortunately one of those things. I feel like I say this almost every stream though, but we're going to be talking about something that is necessary for a game to function well and play well, but is maybe not everyone's favorite thing to do. Unless you do like making collisions, in which case I'm happy for you.
And you have job security.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I mean, a lot of those things that we cover are the things that are like, I mean, if everybody loves doing it and it's easy and can just be done, then you don't need to go in depth for. So these are the kinds of things that we like to do because it's like, oh no, these are some stuff that maybe people aren't as familiar with or they don't like to do, or they often just try to skirt past with the bare minimum, which sometimes works, usually doesn't. Aaron would have some words with you, and I think Sam as well about collisions for those who just try not
yeah.
to worry too much about them, but they are pivotal. They are key. Why am I using pivot all the time? I need to
I don't
stop.
know. This
Gonna,
is
it's
your
gonna,
word for today.
it is. Everybody, word of the day, pivot.
Pivot. Yes.
Pivot.
But yeah, so that's going to be the main topic of today. We're going to talk a little bit about the differences between complex and simple collision, good times to use both, examples of really common examples of when collision is maybe not being used the way that it should. And you've probably noticed instances like this even in games that you have played as well. So we're here to help you kind of circumvent some of those easy to make mistakes. Or if you're already aware that you're making them and you're just, hiding them under the rug, then we're here to call you out. And you can feel attacked because you are.
We're talking to
uh,
you, Steven. You know who you are.
Yeah, you know who you are. But yeah, so we'll get into that. Um, Another quick thing I want to throw out is that both myself and Dan are in precarious weather conditions at the moment. So, as long as the weather deems that the show will go uninterrupted, everything will be fine. But if there's ever a point in time where things look a little sus for a minute, we're working through it. We're doing the best we can given the circumstances. Um, but I think that's it. So let me check chat real quick. There's one more thing that we got to address before we get into it.
Oh no.
Because we have to.
Oh no.
They need to know, Dan. Why are you wearing two sets of headphones?
You guys don't wear two sets of headphones?
Me just desperately looking for another set of headphones real quick.
I was really hoping that you just had one on hand and you would just put it on.
Usually I do. I'm disappointed in myself, honestly.
All right, we're gonna stop the stream, guys. We're gonna come back. We're gonna pretend that never happened. And we're gonna really land this joke.
We'll both have two sets. Yeah.
No, this time only you have the two sets.
And we tell everyone that I have always only been the one with two pairs of headphones.
100%. Matches of gaslighting. No, as I said, I am the live stream operator here, so I have. Oh, they're kind of stacked on top of each other. This one I use to hear Tina, and this one I use to monitor the stream audio. So if it's terrible, let me know. But I'm trying to make sure that it sounds as reasonable as possible, considering I am splitting it at the moment.
Yes.
So
yeah,
and it's fashionable.
Yes, of course, making a trend.
If you can't decide what you want to wear both.
Exactly. More is more is more. All right, so let me just get my notes right here real quick, and then we'll dig into the topic for today. We'll dig into collision. For anyone that just got in here and is wondering about if today was supposed to be about animation stuff, I recommend backing the stream up just a little bit because I just gave a quick rundown on why we're not talking about animation this week, but we still will. It will happen. I promise you. It just can't today. So yeah, talking about collisions, I guess, for posterity, and at risk of over-explaining, because I'm sure most of you here understand what collision is and its purpose, but just in case we have any newbies who might have just happened upon the stream and don't know too much about any of this, I'll give a quick explanation of what collisions are. And in Unreal Engine, specifically, I feel like I should add that little asterisk. In Unreal Engine, collision is the ability of objects to interact with other elements in a game or in a scene, a project that you make, such as players, weapons, environments, props, all that kind of good stuff. It's what makes you able to do things with other things is collision. So it's obviously a broad topic. There's a lot of things surrounding collision, a lot of things that pull from collision, and I'm gonna try and do a bit of a general coverage of a lot of these sorts of themes, but there's many aspects of collision that you can go very in-depth into. It can get very technical very quickly, and especially if you're a studio working with, I'd say, even more than like 5 people, you'll probably want to look into things like collision profiles and setting up custom collision profiles and making sure that that is consistent across your whole studio and across all of your assets and all that good stuff. I won't be covering that today. I will not be covering profiles and making custom collision profiles. However, I got you. And we have a link to a discussion that actually happened at, I think it was last year's Unreal Fest, talking specifically about those kinds of aspects of collision. So if that's something you're interested in learning more about, we'll drop the link for that in the chat here in just a moment. And you can watch that. Highly recommend it. It's fantastic. It's about half an hour, so it's not a super long watch. And all the information in it is very succinct. We'll get you exactly what you need to know and get you going. But that's something to be aware of while we're talking about this, even though that's not what we're going to be talking about directly. So throwing that out there, let me catch my breath. I'm already out of breath. Am I talking fast? Who am I? Where am I? Yeah, it's a much broader topic as a whole. There's a lot of things that we can chat about, but the main things that I personally want to kind of cover a little bit today is how collision affects things like just general gameplay, how it affects player maneuverability in your scene, in your world, as well as things like environmental cover and specifically like AI line of sight or being able to take cover from attacks or weapon fire or things like that. And then just overall performance, because collision is, if you were unaware, collision is one of those things that can very much impact performance very heavily, very, very quickly, especially if you're just. The engine is incredibly intelligent, and I cannot overstate that. But there are some functions from the engine that if you just leave it alone and don't do anything with it, that would probably be serviceable up to a certain point. But if you're making either a very large world or a very condensed world, you have a lot of props or a lot of assets in it, you need to really start thinking about making custom collision and really analyzing the difference between complex and simple collisions, and the times when you need to be making your own, the times where it's okay to let the engine take the wheel, and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, yes.
The engine is incredibly smart. And that's almost the problem, because if you give it a ton of data to process, it will do that for you.
Yeah.
But it might be at the expense of performance or functionality. So,
yes, exactly.
You also need to be smart. The engine's smart and you need to be smart. So you give the engine exactly what it needs.
Yeah. So, oh no. Someone game dev says 20 million poly mesh with complex is simple. Please don't do that.
If you want your computer to explode, absolutely do that.
Actually, yeah, you know what? If this is a stress test, 10 out of 10. Yeah. Highly recommend. Just use your nanite mesh as your collision, actually. You know, I think that's what we should do.
I don't even know what would happen. I almost want to try it and just see.
Don't. I hear you. I see you. I recognize what you're saying. And just maybe don't, bro.
A word from the wise.
Don't do that.
Don't do
that. But if you're wondering about why collision performance is such a big deal, and it has been since ever and still is and probably will remain that way for a while, because obviously we have things to skirt around some of the historical issues we've had when it comes to complex meshes, like nanite, if we want to go to that conversation, right? Obviously, nanite fixes a lot of problems that we've had with calculating dense meshes that are we're just talking about the static mesh, right? Obviously, there's many key instances where you may not want to use nanite for certain meshes, but if it's just a statue or something that's really high poly with a lot of detail that you don't want to have to make an LOD or go through all this extra pipeline, sure, you can toss nanite on there. If it's just sitting there, it's pretty, there you go, it's done. But that's because for that static mesh, it's static, it's likely not moving. You don't got to worry about it. Collision performance, or collision data specifically, goes through so many different layers of data compilation. So a single poly for a collision mesh, you're not just thinking about the fact that it is a single poly, it's how many times are you having movement sweeps that are being calculated with this collision poly. Are you having to have it set up where AI recognizes this mesh as something that it cannot see through or that it cannot attack through? And if so, how many different AI functions is that in relation to? There's all different kinds of gameplay and different interactions with collision, and that's why having something super complex tanks your performance, because the larger the mesh that the engine is trying to understand and compile data for what interactions are happening with it, the worse your performance is just fundamentally, because it's more functions. It's more that it needs to calculate and understand and work through. So, long story short, cutting down on the jargon, simple collision, generally speaking, is better. There we go. Pat on the back. Stream is over. There we go. Thank you for coming, everybody. But I could just talk for a while and that would be great and all, but we should probably just show some stuff as well at some point. So I'm gonna do that. We're gonna pull up the engine. Specifically, I have a level here that was one of our monthly free assets that was available, I think 2 months ago. Something like that. So if you've been collecting them each month, you should have access to all of these assets as well. And if you don't, that's okay. We still do other free stuff every single month.
Speaking of which, pick up the July marketplace assets if you haven't already. There's a few more days to do so. Some pretty cool stuff in there. So don't forget to go grab that.
Yeah. Don't forget. You got to do it. You must. It's a requirement.
You're literally turning down free stuff, which, I mean, I guess everybody has their reasons for doing things, but.
All right. This is just me taking forever to get it pulled up, which means we can give Dan his obligatory I told you so moment, because before this, he was like, hey, you should probably get that pulled up so it's ready to go. And I was like, don't worry about it. It'll be fine.
For what it's worth, I said, Tina, do you want to do that? And you said no.
You're very kind about it.
I put the ball in your court and let you dig your own grave.
I said no. And here we are. All right.
Oh, I think I'm getting a signal.
Gasp. Things can happen and work occasionally.
Okay. Let's see it.
All right. So right here, what I've got pulled up is, I believe it was called the Fantasy Bundle Environment Pack from 2 months ago. This is the cave scene. There's a village scene, a city scene, and a cave scene. I went with the cave scene, obviously. And so the main stuff that I want to talk about today, the reason I chose this one is because it has a lot of the examples of what I was kind of mentioning before, of those specific types of assets where it's easy to make very simple common mistakes on. So we're going to talk about things such as doorways. As you can see here, doorway. It's catching my mouse, right? Because I'm talking with my cursor like it's my hand, and it's going to be really unfortunate. Yes, that's not here.
It is picking it up.
Fantastic.
It's small, but you should be able to see it.
It's there, though. It's small, but it's there. That's all that matters.
Actually, believe it or not, moving it makes it easier to find. I find once it's static, then I lose it.
Just
like a
this
cat
is the
now.
whole stream now. Yeah. So we're going to talk specifically about doorways, or really just anything that is a hole in a wall otherwise. So this could also apply to windows.
A hole in a wall.
Trying to think of other examples of holes in walls that should structurally make sense. And I think it pretty much is limited to doors and windows. Oh, my brain was really trying to stretch for a third.
Broken walls.
Broken walls for when you punch your drywall.
Portals into the abyss.
Portals into the... Thank you. How could I forget?
I don't know.
Honestly. That should be the number one.
We'll have words with you later.
And then another example that we've got right here is stairs as well.
I never noticed the tic-tac-toe hieroglyphics. That's very funny. On the right wall.
Oh, yeah.
And the sad face.
Beautiful. Yeah, because you lost. Honestly, same. I feel that. But we'll talk about doorways, windows, stairs. Stairs are a huge agitator of collision. And y'all have probably experienced bad collision on stairs. It is like one of the most age-old collision examples of players actually noticing, like, wait a second, what is going on here?
They are incredibly important and often neglected. Back in my education days, that was something that was very, very heavily touched on, reinforced over and over and over again, and still had projects where it was not done correctly. So I am
It
very happy.
happens.
I'm very happy for Tina to again reinforce this, because nothing is more frustrating as a player than getting stuck on stuff or just having the result that you don't expect happen, especially when that result ends in you failing or taking damage or whatever.
Yeah, well, and that is, I'm glad you said that actually, because that is a really important part of making sure you have good collision. Because this is a personal opinion. This is not me stating this is fact, but in my personal opinion, I think the two things that could really pull a player totally out of any kind of immersion they might be having with your project is bad collision or bad audio design.
Or
I think
hieroglyphics that are tic tac toe.
I'm immersed. I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't know.
I'm there.
My mind went straight to that, and I just wanted a whole train in my brain.
It adds character to the world, right? Because
I
that was
actually
me.
do.
I lost 3 times and I was sad about it. Um, but yeah, so really anytime something reacts in the world that you have created that doesn't make sense to the player, that will immediately pull them out of immersion. And collision is, you know, usually key to most of those instances.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
it's really when any input does not yield the output you expect. Like if you're like, I'm going to input movement up the stair and I do not, then you're like,
yeah,
what the why?
exactly. We're also going to talk about bridges. This one is actually an example of a bridge that you probably wouldn't have very many issues with. But if this had railings on the side that people could hold on to, that's where you would probably start to encounter issues with default collisions and things like that. So we'll cover all of those good things.
There is an instance though, even with like this default bridge that you might have problems with, and that's if you're trying to go underneath
Going
it.
under. Yeah.
So if there was a pathway under there, or you're, I don't know, in this place, I would imagine flying a dragon.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Leo here said, in my books, bad collision is when the hitbox is bigger than the visual aspect of the projectile slash weapon, which is fair.
And honestly, in a
Honestly.
lot of cases, that's where it's really noticeable. Like if you're
Yeah.
trying to peek around a corner and your bullets are hitting an invisible wall that just shouldn't be there.
Yeah. So to start us off, I'm gonna just wander around in this level a little bit, and we'll talk about some of the things that we've experienced. I want to make sure that I state first and foremost, though, before we begin this is not me knocking on the creator of this level or these assets at all. These are beautiful. This scene is stunning. All of these assets are really well made. What I'm talking about specifically is optimizing collision for gameplay, and that is by no means a requirement for people that are making asset packs. That is absolutely up to whoever is using these assets in their project. If you're making it a playable game, then it's on you to make sure that your collision is maneuverable and navigatable. So just keeping that in mind. This is not me knocking on them. I think they're wonderful and their work is amazing. But this is just ways that we would improve the collision on some of these assets to make it playable, to make this a fully playable level.
And that is something
Um,
that's a good thing to reiterate, is that collision, I mean, outside of like some sort of simulation examples where you're using physics to achieve certain goals, collision really is kind of a gameplay thing. Like if you're using this to make like films or just visual concepts or anything like that, or anything that doesn't actually require a player or an AI or some other entity to like navigate a world, then they're not that important. So you'll see actually in a lot of these asset packs is that they're kind of made for like virtual production or things like that. So they might not have paid any mind to that because it wasn't necessary for what they were making.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So we'll go to our first example here, the stairs, the wonderful, beautiful stairs. If I run up them, you can see it a little bit there. We're in first person for this because I feel like it really helps to show from your perspective the problem here. And if you look closely, the screen, the camera, is bouncing as I step up and down the stairs. Now, there could technically be, in some instances, maybe someone could view that as realistic movement. I would say the problem with this is things like motion sickness. uh, is the key one, but also if you have too much collision on stairs, if a player gets stuck on a stair or cannot smoothly go up and down or things like that, that's when you start to encounter problems. If you're doing something in first person, since this is first person camera, and you want to have something like realistic head bob or things like that, that is actually movement that I would highly recommend you add in through specifically your camera movement and not through the collision of your environment or the collision of your environment assets. That way you can actually set an option for things like disabling head bob. So that way if someone doesn't want to have that in their experience, they can turn it off and then just smoothly run up and down the stairs. And you're also less likely to encounter problems with players getting caught on collision or caught on meshes or not being able to navigate the scene easily.
A couple other considerations too with that is I've heard this argument. Actually, I heard it many times as an instructor. It's like, well, I want the feeling of going up the stairs. Like I want it to jitter, and there's an argument for that. But one of the main things, and Tina, if you could actually just run up and down the stairs a couple times that you
Sure.
consider, if you go up towards it really slow, like you know those old Resident Evil stepping animations. Try to go up it kind of slowly and see what kind of result we get.
It's going to be a little staccato, but
are you on a mouse or a keyboard?
Yeah,
oh,
I sure am.
Yeah,
okay.
with a controller, that'd be a little bit easier to notice. If you go slowly, you will kind of get an incremental, like, kind of step up that feels a little bit natural. That only really makes sense to, and again, use it like Tina said the other way. But if you were going to like hardcore, like I want to use the collision to achieve this, you would want a slow movement speed because that would kind of make that step. You actually are more likely to get stuck with a slow movement speed. But the real example, and this one Tina can actually demonstrate, is kind of sprinting up the stairs. I don't know if anybody's ever actually sprinted up a stair. You don't do it by like stepping on every single stair as you go up. You're going to skip like 4 or 5 of them. You're going to really sprint up there. So having that juddery motion actually doesn't even make sense in that instance because it would really be more like duh, and then you're at the top.
Yeah, nobody sprints by hitting every single step. No one does
Tina
that.
just twinkle toes up it like as fast as possible. She looks like she's doing drills.
Okay, here's the thing. If I miss a step, I'm falling. I don't want to risk that.
You know, I don't think it matters how fast you go for that, though.
Listen, we're having words after this.
Why did I invite you on the stream?
But yeah, after it is actually, it's a good point. Most people probably don't do that.
I mean, it's very difficult. You're probably more likely to trip doing that way because you're trying to go fast, but also hit every single step. The reason, just the mental image of you doing that is my favorite thing I've ever seen.
Hitting stairs full speed. I have to hit every single stair. I'm sorry. I don't make the rules. I just live them. This is how it is.
I also have the vision of you like going up steps, even if you take it slowly, like you hit one step and you step 4 times and you go up to the next step and you step 4 times. Like even going normal pace, you're just still doing this up it.
The best is when you have, we're totally derailing right now, but that's okay.
No, this is all collision related.
Yeah, it's just like imagine there's the little landing in between, right? So you run up the steps and then you walk normally for a couple steps and then you run up the next. Anyway, we're continuing.
And I've actually seen a couple comments here saying like that they would handle the stairs the same way, and that's fine. But look at how quick this pawn is moving up these stairs. Like it's virtually impossible to hit every step at that speed. Like you would have to skip a couple moving at that speed. So yeah, it would depend too on like what is the context of the game. If the context of the game is that the character pawn moves very quickly, then if they're moving up a staircase that quickly, they're going to have to skip some stairs. Now, whether you would do that if you were, in real life is one thing, but in this instance, for it to make sense physically or to make the animation look remotely, clean, you wouldn't have it snapping to every single step as they bolt up a staircase.
I do see a comment here about how you'd handle stair movements would be different from first person than third person perspective, though, I would assume. And not typically, actually. As far as the collision itself goes, it's usually the same between both. Because part of it's also consistency, right? So if you're having a smooth, navigatable experience and then suddenly go into a lurch or a jump or things like that, that's disorienting very much to the player. But also, when you pull the camera back in an instance like this, your character, especially if the camera is following your character, the camera will still bounce even as you're going up the stairs with it pulled back. So it's, unless you specifically alter the way that the camera is following the player, you're still going to have that jittery camera movement even in third person perspective. And in case you're worried about something like it not looking like you're actually walking up the steps, I'll be explaining in a moment how you can make sure that you still do that while having the smooth collision experience of actually walking up and down.
Yeah, some game dev just explained basically that you'll go into that too.
Yeah.
Tina, now I get the power of putting you on the spot for a second. Do you have any way of demonstrating why we have that judder with it, like kind of explaining what's actually happening with the collision and the pawn?
That is exactly what I was about to go into.
Wow.
What a perfect
teed you up for that one.
For real. So this is me looking at the static mesh that's made up of these stairs. It's just duplicated a few different times. But by default, what we're looking at here, this is the simplified collision that is currently applied to these assets.
And it's not, and it's terrible, actually. Like I kind of expected it to be a little worse based off the camera movement. So still could be refined, but
yeah, it's okay. The main thing is from the side here, you can see that there's too many mini ramps, basically. That's why we're still getting that camera bounce, that camera jitter while going up, especially because, keep in mind, this is a duplicated asset. So if this was the only asset and this was extended out, then you could probably get away with maybe having a couple mini bounces like that in it. But this is duplicated, I think, 3 or 4 times after this. So all of those bounces, you're hitting 4 times that amount going up just this one set of stairs. So what we want to do for something like this instead, of course, and I've seen it in the comments already a few times, is a ramp instead. So we're going to go into the collision here. We're going to remove the simple collision that was spawned there initially by that. I'm losing my voice. Oh no.
Well, while you walk through that, I will just quickly say, for those who are not aware of why you actually get that stutter with the collision, is that you might see a character, or you will see a character, and they'll have legs and that would step on the steps and make their way up. So you kind of get the idea that like there's these 2 points of contact that happen and that they're aware of the world and they move up, but the actual player or AI or whatever it is just a pawn, which is a capsule. It's just like a literal elongated sphere, and all that thing does is it slides across your environment. So if you end up with a stair that let me see if I can line up to the camera for this, that goes like this, and this is how that collision works, then it's going to slide up to it, it's going to pop up, it's going to slide, it's going to pop up, and it's going to keep doing that. So even though you're using stairs, what you want is a ramp collision so that pawn just moves up the stairs normally. And then you can use things like IKs and things like that to trace into the normals and all that stuff so that it actually steps on each step for the animation. But in terms of the pawn, it's just kind of sliding up a ramp.
Right. Exactly. So
was that enough for your voice to recover?
Yes, thank you. So here I just made, it's a simple box collision here, set it as a ramp. I have it going a little bit over the ends and the bottom just because we know that this mesh in particular has been duplicated and set up next to each other. And we want to make sure that that ramp is consistent all the way through. There's not a gap where the player may get stuck where they have to either jump or something just to get onto the next bit of stairs there. So it's okay to have your collision extending a little bit past where it typically would to make sure that that movement stays consistent and smooth.
The only thing you want to be mindful with that is that even though it's going beyond the actual mesh, that it's not sticking up too high, because then if you try to approach the stairs from the other direction, you might hit that and actually have a bit of a bump. So you want to try to get that as close to, meeting with whatever geometry that it would then connect to, so that there's as minimal of that hitch as possible. If you're using like extremely modular down to the grid level things, then you can actually snap it directly to the grid to ensure that there's no issue with that. With organic things like this, though, there's usually going to be a little bit more wiggle room there. So you just want to try to get it as tight as possible.
Yeah. So we'll do this as the actual like navigatable collision here. Save that. Now when I pop back into here, when I play, instead of just doing a camera, and I run up these stairs, you can see, there we go. Nice and smooth. We're no
Even
longer
on
getting
stream,
that.
that's very noticeable, like how much smoother that is.
Yeah. No more jittering. And specifically because of the way that the collision was set up, we're not getting stuck at the bottom of the stairs or the top of the stairs. It's a pretty smooth mounted dismount. Now I do want to address, of course, if this was in third person, we still want it to look like they're walking up the stairs. They're not just at a ramp. Their feet are at an angle and they're sliding up. So what we would do for that is you would still have a version of the complex collision. And honestly, even for the complex collision, I would argue that the collision we started with wouldn't necessarily be what you wanted to use for this example. Instead, you would probably do... Come on, collision. Where are we? Where am I? Who am I? So in your collision, you would want to have it set from default, and you'd probably want to use complex collision as simple. And this duplicates the same mesh that is currently there. As you can see here, it duplicates it and it uses that exact same mesh as the collision. You do not want to do this, like I said, for your actual navigatable, where things are interacting with it typically, because that's where your performance is going to tank horribly. But you can use this version of the collision data specifically for your animations and your IK rig, so that your feet will trigger as it actually hitting and walking up these steps and showing that interaction without that collision then being used for every single other instance of data collection in the game. So you can still get your realistic movement without sacrificing performance. Thankfully, you can do both.
And I've seen this come up a couple times, at least in the Twitch chat, which is there's no one way to do anything in the game engine, which is both a blessing and a curse. There are other ways to tell IK what to do. Like this isn't the only way to handle something like that. So it's really going to depend on your pipeline. It's going to depend on your engine. It's going to depend on your needs. Typically, the more complicated the geometry gets, especially with things like crazy high nanite things, like you're going to want to use like LOD, like the lowest LOD nanite possible thing, or honestly, in my opinion, just create a custom collision. But there's multiple ways to handle something like that. So it's going to depend on your use case.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's stairs. There's another type of stair that is not in this level. Oh, I'm actually playing it. I really need to figure out what I am actually playing and what I'm not.
You gotta have
there's
the
a type of stair that
know.
hasn't used in here, and that is round stairs. So I'll just make some real quick. We'll set some curved stairs right there. Go back into selection here. And then play. So these are probably going to be even more jarring than those ones were, honestly. It wasn't too bad because of the speed of which we're walking, but when I take it slow, yeah, when I take it slow, you can definitely see the bounce there. And this is full on like driving a car, hitting every single pothole along the way bounce. Now, the problem when it comes to stairs like this, obviously, that are wrapping around, collision is always convex. It is not concave. So this would definitely be an example where I think the best way of going about this would be creating your custom collision in whatever modeling software you're using. Because you can do that. You can make your collision boxes in a separate program. And as long as you change the wow, how am I forgetting the term for it? The letters at the beginning of your asset.
UCX.
Yes. There is a different name for it though. But yeah.
The prefix?
Prefix. There you go.
Okay.
That's what it is.
All right. I didn't know which part you were asking. I didn't know if you're just trying to figure out the the
yeah, it
literal
is
word. Yeah.
UCX. That is literally what the prefix would be.
Yeah.
There are different ones that you can use though if you're wanting to specifically have it set as a sphere collision or a capsule collision. Then instead of UCX, you can use things like I believe it's USP.
Shout out to some game dev. They're right on it. Yeah, UBX, UCP, USP, and UCX.
Yes, that's exactly it. And that's for box, capsule, sphere. And then the last one is for any other type of collision that you may be making that's custom. But then that way, when you package your FBX all together and bring it in, the engine will recognize those prefixes and assign the correlating collision data with those meshes. So things like this are a perfect example of when it would be good to do something like that in a separate software. Obviously, the goal is that eventually we can just do all this directly in the engine itself. But for now, it is easier to do your custom collisions in Maya, Blender, wherever you may be doing the majority of your modeling.
And we've made great strides on that front. My old man is showing where there was nothing. It was all all in another software, and you had to bring that in. And if it didn't work, you're going back, son.
Yeah,
you're fixing that thing. So
absolutely. But it would serve the same function as these ones would, where you would have a ramp that let me be able to have my mouse here. You would set it up as a ramp, but you would split it into sections that would as closely match the direction of the stairs as it would go as it's built. So something to keep in mind for that. I wanted to make sure that I at least touched on that because there wasn't an example of it in this scene, but obviously spiral staircases are prevalent. They're a pretty commonly used architecture tool, and they look nice. So this is one way that you can go about something like that. So working off of that same concept that I said before of where collisions are always convex, they're not concave. When it comes to cutouts in walls, or like I said, doors or windows or things like that, by default, unless you, like I said before, just set your mesh as its own collision, which I really don't recommend doing, you will get, this is made up of a bunch of different assets right now, but let's talk hypothetical for a second. And let's say that this entire entryway here was just one entire piece. Bringing that in by default, we would not be able to walk through this doorway here. There would just be a wall of collision that would stop us from moving. And that's because that would be a concave section of the collision there. So that would be another instance of needing to go in and manually create whatever collision you want for this scene. I will show a sort of example of how I would do that in a moment here too. But there's one other thing. Obviously, this is all pretty simple entry-level stuff right there, just for anyone who might be new to the conversation or unaware of those things. Now, going a little bit more advanced, I do want to talk about kitbashing. And when it comes to creating collision or custom collision for especially environmental assets that are probably going to be overlapping or intersecting at some point. So like the rocks here on this wall, these are all separate assets. And even now you can see that some of them are intersecting each other, overlapping a little bit. which is fine because especially for something that's supposed to look very naturalistic, it achieves that. You know, it looks like this is how some of these would naturally form. We have, um, without making a bajillion different versions of these rocks, just using the same one repeated, moving around. The problem therein lies that each of these has its own individualized collision, and that's not necessary, especially when you're doing like huge chunks like this where you have multiple giant rocks that are crisscrossing, partially intersecting with each other. There's no reason really for all of those to have individualized collision that wraps all the way behind each individual piece. Because one, I mean, at least in this level specifically, the player wouldn't even interact with it. So in theory, you could probably just disable the collision on a lot of these if this was your only level and you're not reusing these assets elsewhere. Or if you want to cut down on how many individualized pieces of collision data the engine is trying to compute and correlate with your different collision profiles or things like that, instead, you can just combine all of them and then make your collision for all those combined pieces. So for that, and I'm going to show you how you can do that directly in Engine. This is, of course, another example where there's a ton of different ways you could probably do this in and of itself. But if you wanted to do something like that quickly, just here directly in Engine, not having to pop out to a different program and just handle something like that where you have this series of rocks here, you like how the formation looks, and maybe you plan on grouping all of those together and wanting to repeat that specific group, whether it be through PCG or just manual placement. This would be a good way of setting that up, getting a collision that works for this pair of assets, and then being able to duplicate it without worrying about having all of that unnecessary collision data on its own.
Quick thing that I want to chime in real quick too, as a practical thing, for maybe those who are not actually don't have a lot of dev experience, or they're new to this and they're learning. I mean, that's kind of the goal of this, is to talk about collision. So if you're learning things like this, if you have any practical experience, anybody who's ever like broken out of bounds in video games, this is actually something that stumped me for a while when I was really young. Is I would get out of the bounds of the video games. I'm like, man, I can't wait to explore. And I would fall through everything. As soon as I was out of the map, nothing had collision, and I would just fall right through it. And I had no idea why that was the case. And it's for this exact reason. It is to save as much resources on performance as possible. This was something that was, I mean, I would argue was still very necessary, but it was even more necessary then when resources were scant, like when they were so limited. So in a lot of instances, a lot of meshes don't even have collisions at all. And then the environment artist would build out the environment and then build those in with just like some simple cube blocking volumes or things like that to then keep them in. So I saw this in the Twitch chat, so I wanted to call it out, is another solution to this. What Tina's doing is great, but another solution to this is just say, hey, those things don't have collision, and we just put big old blocking volume there. One, six-sided thing that just goes there and makes that super performant, and it still stops the player from falling through it or anything like that. Now, with something like this that has a lot of geometry shapes and things like that, you would just kind of have that weird thing. You just hit this like invisible wall and fall. You wouldn't be able to actually climb on any of these things. But that is one of those things to consider if like, hey, I'm trying to keep this as performant as possible. They're not supposed to actually climb on this anyways. It's purely to sell the scene, to sell the world. That would be another example of something, of a way to kind of handle that. And again, the use case is really important too. Like Tina said, if you have these in multiple different levels or specifically open world games, those are different considerations where you might have to handle it differently, where you actually do keep a lot of those collisions but then find other ways of calling that information too. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, but I just wanted to call that out.
For sure. It's heavily dependent on what your game is and what kind of experience it is that you're building.
Ye old clip brushes.
Clip brush, yeah. Because if this is a very linear sort of experience and there's no reason for the player to ever go out of the bounds that you have set for them, then yeah, it makes sense. Save yourself and them the performance and just put a cube there, you know? And you don't even have to worry about a floor at that point too. You could also just put some kind of trigger box in the bottom where if the player passes this threshold, it resets them to a certain position, or, you know, there's a lot of different ways to get around things like that too. But it's heavily dependent on what it is that you're building out.
Yeah, if there's something that I can reinforce, because it's true of basically everything, is know your use case. Like, there's so many different things to do in so many different situations, and the important thing is to not be like, oh, I found the one rule that rules them all. It's to know what the rules are, where they apply, and then how to apply them when they make sense. And like, that's true of everything. It's true of collisions, it's true of modular textures and modular assets and tileable and a million other things. Understand the use case. That's what's important.
Yeah. All right.
What we're doing right now is throwing as many use cases at you as possible. All right, Tina,
exactly. Go. Yes. All right. So I'm going to show you how you can make just a quick group collision for grouped up assets like this. So first, we're going to take all these things, and down under level, we're going to create a new packed level actor. Going to put it wherever you want. I've made specifically a combo assets folder here, and that's where I'm going to be putting these. I'll name it static mesh combo rock. Very complex. I'm gonna save that out, save the blueprint there under the same name. All right. So we're gonna pop out of this level and we're gonna go into, yeah, sure, we'll save it. We'll go into the other level here, the packed level. I'm gonna change this to unlit so we can see what the heck we're doing. So first, what you're gonna want to do, select everything in here, and we're gonna want to make sure that there's no collision on it already. Right now, collision presets are set to default. We're actually just gonna change it to straight up no collision, so that these don't have anything on them. We're not worrying about what might be there by default, because we're gonna make our freaking own, dude.
Yeah, brother.
Yeah.
Get it.
So from here, we're going to pop over from selection mode into modeling mode. We're going to go down to voxel. I said vexel. That's a different thing. Voxel wrap. And that right there just, boom, combines all the things that are intersecting, has made its own asset here. You will want to make sure that you turn on remove internal geometry, so you don't have internal faces that are clogging things up or causing any unwarranted issues or things like that. And from here, we'd take this new collision here. Well, first, accept the voxel wrap. Allow the voxel wrap into your lives.
Commit your changes.
Yes. Give it a second. There we go. All right. So from here, we're going to go and we want to make it not visible, right? So you would turn off your visibility. This is specifically selecting the voxel wrap, which is why we're not seeing the other meshes underneath it. But don't worry about that. Everything's okay. And then the other thing you'd want to make sure you turn on is actor hidden in game, because we don't want to see this collision that we're making, obviously. So as long as you have the visibility turned off and make sure that it's hidden in game, then you don't have to worry about it showing up in there. And now you have all that. The other thing, this is actually something I picked up from Aaron Langmead, which is so smart. I'm going to add a tag here, and I'm just going to name it something like hidden collision or something like that. Because then now if you wanted to use this asset that we just created in something like PCG, you can very easily set up in your blueprint that anything marked as hidden collision is not to be rendered. It's pulled into the PCG and it'll still be placed with these packed levels that you're populating about, but it'll make sure that it keeps those same stipulations for the collision that you had set before. And that's that. That's one easy way to do that, just directly in there. Now, that being said, obviously, as you saw, the voxel wrap is not the simplest collision you've ever seen in your life. However, that even though it was how do I phrase this? Oh my gosh. I'm going to start this sentence over. Uh, it's not a bunch of intersecting collision and collision that's unnecessary. So it's still better on performance. It's going to save you a lot of headache overall doing something like that versus just leaving everything exactly as it is. But again, this is also, I'm thinking more of a specific use case of these assets are used repeatedly through something like PCG or out in an open world setting or things like that. But you know, things like that to consider while going through. So that is an example of how to do some of these like combo asset collisions if you don't want to be constantly pulling these assets in and out of the engine into a different program, so on and so forth. And we're going to go back to the cave because I like the cave. And I'm not going to save it because we don't need to. Oh, it is raining so hard. I have so much fear in my heart and soul right now. Not because I'm scared of rain, but because I'm scared of the rain taking my power out.
If it does, I will hijack the stream and
Thank you.
become
Hijack it, derail it, talk
Yeah,
about something that's not collision entirely. We're
gonna get philosophical.
Yeah, so yeah, that's some of those examples there. Trying to remember what else I was talking about. Oh yeah, doorways, same thing as before. You would just go into your custom collision setup. You could just use box collisions to go around the sides and the top, and then you can walk your merry way right through there. Same thing with bridges. If this had higher railings, it would likely by default set the box to stretch all the way across. You would want to go in and just set collision along the railings there. And unless you plan on, I'm going to look at these as an example of railings, right? Let's just imagine, bear with me for a second, that these are like way smaller. We'll get there. Give me a second. It'll make sense. I promise. Grab all these things.
I was gonna say, I mean, you do have
bit.
a scale tool.
I'm getting there, Dan. Trust the process.
I am.
Trust the process. Those, I'm not gonna lie, those looked a little questionable for a second there, so I'm glad that it turned out less questionable.
Look like they melted. They look like candy.
It kind of looks like slab rock, sorta. Anyway, so if you didn't want it set up in a way where the player could squeeze through these sections and fall off the side to their death, then you would just set one box that goes straight across all of those so that the player is stuck in this pathway that you have set for them, right? The only time that you would really want individual collision for each of these railing pillars. Stay with me, everybody. Stay with me. The only way you would want individualized collision on these is if you wanted the opportunity, like I said, for the player to be able to squeeze through and potentially fall to their death. Or maybe find a hidden secret. I don't know. There could be something. There's plenty of games where there's falls that you would assume you would die from, and then you don't, and instead something really cool happens, like Elden Ring. All of those jumps of faith are so scary, but it happens.
So. I want to add one other stipulation to that, though, is, and this depends on your game and how you're tracing through your world, but gaps like that could also be worth having built into the collision in games where you throw projectiles like grenades or fireballs or things like that, because it will absolutely hit an invisible wall right between those gaps and not
Yeah.
fall. That usually doesn't happen with bullets and stuff because those are usually traced in a different way, but especially things that are physics based really like to hit wonky collisions.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is something else that I did want to chat about a little bit, is when it comes to collision for even very simple assets. So we'll just use the pillar as a great example here. Um, you want simple collision for these things because obviously we don't want something super overly complex, especially this pillar in particular. Besides, my drumstick railings, as someone pointed out. These besides that instance, these pillars are still just in and of themselves repeatedly used several times throughout this whole scene. So you don't want to have something super complex because it is repeated so many times. But that being said, there could still be instances where you want to make sure that it has workable, functionable collision for the examples of what you were just saying, Dan, because these are large enough um, where
Especially in this instance.
easily you could use something like this as cover. So if you have enemies all the way at the other side, they're shooting arrows or something at you, and you're trying to use this pillar as cover, you should reward players for creative and intuitive gameplay choices, right? So even if you don't necessarily have like a take cover option inherently in your game, you should still reward them for being able to duck behind a pillar or a wall or something like that, use a quick health potion or whatever you have, and protect themselves from projectiles. So with that, it's another instance where collision is really important to have everything set up and work
Yeah. The
appropriately.
best rule of thumb when it comes to collision is you want to make it as simple as possible while still maintaining the needs of the collision. So you don't want to go so simple that you're like, oh, I can't throw a grenade through here, or I can't like arrows hit this invisible plane around that pillar because there's kind of a slight concave part to it, or anything like that. Like if you're going that low that it's like affecting what you need it to do, then you've gone too low. But you want to get it right at that edge of like it does exactly what it needs to and nothing more. You don't need a million polygons on it. It's just enough to serve the purpose of the collision.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the default collision that we have on this pillar asset, which again is not terrible. It's really not bad. Um, Although super quickly, I did see someone, how would one handle an AoE situation that gets blocked behind a pillar? That would be a line trace that you would do, an AI line trace. And that it would get blocked by whatever collision you have set up for your pillar here. Um, but speaking of situations like that, so like we saw, standing at the base of one of these, it's still a fairly large pillar. It was about this large when we were standing in game next to it. But you can see that the extension of this collision, or otherwise the hitbox of this pillar, extends far beyond the actual stone here. And that could be okay, but let me throw out a couple instances where something like that might not be okay. What if this is a PvP game? And someone is trying to aim with extreme accuracy or something like that. I mean, we've all seen the clips where somebody has like their toe just barely sticking out from behind something with a fraction of their health bar left, and then that's the end because just their toe is sticking out, you know? Again, depending on what gameplay it is that you're going for, you should be rewarding players for um, creative or just well done gameplay. And when you have invisible boxes and invisible collision boxes that hamper those kinds of instances, that's a problem. So this, while not technically intrinsically bad, especially from a simple collision standpoint, like if we're just talking performance, this isn't even that bad. Like this wouldn't hit your performance that crazy. The problem really comes in that it's extending beyond where you would actually want it to be.
And this is a great example of knowing the means. If you are, we'll stick with the theme here. It's a first person game where you have like bows and arrows and things like that. You would want to make sure you pay attention to that kind of collision, because those bows and arrows are that bows aren't, but the arrows are going to hit that and stick, in this case almost 6 inches off of the pillar, and just hit and block your shots or block shots coming in at you, and that's going to feel really bad and not great. But if this was like a third person game where all you have is a sword, it doesn't have to be quite as precise, because if you're hitting the thing with your sword, it doesn't matter if you hit it 3 inches away from it or directly on it or like that, because you're taking a long object, you're swinging it, and it's going to hit it whether it's 3 inches off or not. So it's, again, understand your means, know your needs. This is another example, if we're going to go with the first person as the example. Sometimes what
It's so extreme.
Sometimes what artists will do is they'll actually put quite a bit more detail in the collision in the area that the player is going to be, with like a buffer above and a buffer below. But if this pillar goes, 30, 40, 50 feet into the air, you only need a basic box up there, unless your character can climb it or fly or anything like that. But if they're always going to be on the ground and the most they can do is jump up a foot or two, then you really only need that really precise collision in that area. If you were to reuse this asset a lot, and there's an example where you actually stick it halfway into the ground and then the top is supposed to be what you're using as cover, then obviously that breaks down. But again, know the use case. If it's only ever going to be where the player is at the bottom third of it, then the bottom third is really where the main needs of the collisions are, and then everything else can be simple enough. This collision that was on there before, a little more dense than needed, but even though it kind of stuck off from the pillar a little bit, in terms of movement, that's totally fine, because you'll like wander around it. Maybe you might notice like, oh, I'm like slightly off from there, but that doesn't really matter as much in those sorts of instances. But it's really important for things like arrows and grenades, and or if it's a shooter, things like that too. Again,
so like having a capsule at the top here that overextends is fine, because in the case that Dan is talking about, I mean, as we saw, we're never all the way up top there. So unless you're using these assets where you're flipping them upside down, but in this exact instance, they're not. It's fine to have something simplified, because they're never going to have to deal with that. But yeah, probably from like this brick down, you would likely want to have a collision that's more complex and a little bit closer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like LODs for collisions. Yeah, sort of. It's something that you wouldn't really be able to fully get the hang of, I don't think, until you begin actually play testing your project and finding what the sweet spot is for your gameplay and what you're trying to achieve with it. Now, like I said, there's instances where you can play around with these rules, quote unquote. These are not hard rules by any means, but if we're not talking about combat, maybe we're talking about like a stealth game, for example, and you're just specifically trying to block AI's line of sight or something like that. Then in those cases, you might actually want to give your player a little bit extra room there, a little bit of it sticking out on the side, just so then that way it doesn't feel unfair if it is like they're half a centimeter overextended from where their hiding spot is, if they're trying to peek around or see what's happening in the world around them.
Design is so interesting with things like that, because that's a really good way of kind of like buffering that a little bit. Because if you're not aware, if you actually made AI as competent as humans, stealth games would be virtually impossible, and you'd have a terrible, miserable, horrible time. So in a lot of instances, there will be things like padding like that. And then there was I'm sure this happens in many games, but there was a specific example that I remember hearing. I want to say it was for the Splinter Cell games, where the AI have to see a specific number of bones on your character, and that's how they detect you. So if your shoulder's sticking out, it doesn't matter. If your shoulder and your neck and your head is sticking out, then they can see all three of those. Then they go, "Oh no, I can see you now." So there's like little tricks like that too that are always fun.
That's fun. I like
Yeah.
that a lot. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of the
Tracing into
main
your bones
things.
sounds kind of awful though if you say it out loud.
Well, with no context, yeah, that's
Yeah, the AI just
nightmare
trace
fuel.
into your
Thanks for
bones,
that.
and if they get enough of them, you get killed.
If the AI get enough of your bones, you die.
I mean, that's true in all instances, I would think.
These are just facts. We're just
Hmm.
being factual right now.
Hmm.
All right, anyway, so the the last thing that I wanted to talk about is in regards to also camera placement again, and considering where your camera placement is going to be in regards to your player. So specifically, I want to talk about instances kind of like in here, small enclosed spaces, or places that have
Did you see
chat is
Flop? Did
scaring
you
me
did
right
you
now.
see Flubble? I like got in there and looked at that. Actually, I might not sleep tonight now.
um
That is
but yeah,
amazing.
small enclosed spaces or places that are densely populated with a lot of assets or props. Um, this is where we could start to get kind of interesting with a lot of these. Um, and I unfortunately don't have a visual example ready for this, so I'll just be talking. It's up to you, Dan, if you want to leave the stream itself up or not.
Well, I will.
Um,
I want to come back to this in a second, so I can cut away for the moment, but we will come back.
no, I'm closing it. Not allowed.
No.
Opportunity's gone. But yeah, talking about enclosed spaces. So there's some arguments that could be made that not every single tiny prop you have needs to have collision, which is fair. That being said, if you are using physics or you want any of your objects to be interactable that way, whether it's destructible or it can just be flung around the room or all kinds of things like that, which it depends on if you want those things to happen. I feel like most games that are especially reaching for, well, it can go either way. If you want something to feel especially silly, or if you want something to feel especially realistic, then you probably do want some level of collision or physics applied to all of your assets, especially like small props that are just out and available. Like if you go up to a table that is filled with plates and forks and knives and candles or things like that, who doesn't like jumping on a table and running around in a few circles and watching the plates go flying all over the place? Is this just a me experience? I'm going to choose to think that it's not just a me experience this exact moment of time. But
Physics
these things.
in games is one of my favorite things. Like, like I don't I'm scared for the day where like I get bored of physics in games because
Yes.
it still hasn't happened. I've been playing around with physics for 20 plus years in them, and I still have just as much fun throwing stuff at walls and watching it bounce off and explode and break pieces apart and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Always
Yeah,
fun.
exactly. So it could be something that is important to you to have, but keep in mind, unless you have it specifically set up in your collision profile where the character impacts something in the environment by touching it, but the camera doesn't, because that is something you can set up. This is why I was saying I do highly recommend, especially the more complex you go, looking into that Unreal Fest talk I mentioned earlier that is specifically all about like custom profiles and setting up your collision settings for your studio. Because there is ways to tell through functions, assets, how they're supposed to be impacted by collision or if they are at all, depending on what the actor itself is. So you could, like I said, in theory, have it set up where the camera is just not supposed to be blocked at all by these little props, which is probably the most ideal way of going about it. But if you don't know about that, Herein lies the problem. This is where we need to talk about line of sight, and horizons or vistas is another way of phrasing it. If you are creating a small space that you know the player is going to be in for any extended period of time, you really need to play test how your collision is affecting the camera, because I think we've probably all played experiences where maybe it's open world and you're out and about, you're running around, everything's great and fine. And then as soon as you need to go inside of a building, talk to an NPC, pick up a quest, do something, when you walk in, the camera jumps around because it's trying to auto track to an open position in the play space behind the player. But now there are these walls that are suddenly zoomed in way closer behind the player than it is when you're just out in the world, and the camera can be wherever the heck it wants to be. This is when sightline really comes into play. So if you're doing third person and you pull the camera back to where it's maybe level with, a little above, but level with your character's shoulder, right? That's where you have the camera sit, is maybe back right here or something, and it's following around. You need to be mindful of anything and everything that you put at the same height as the camera, because it will impact how that camera looks whenever it interacts with those objects. So let's say if we're going with that level that I was just talking about, picture frames, those are probably sitting at about the same level. It would be really silly if you're trying to just turn your camera and then a picture frame makes your camera freak out and zoom in and out really quickly to your character and back out. So this is where it can get really complex. So we've gone from very simple concepts into kind of medium concepts, and I would say now we're talking about more advanced concepts for sure, where you're going to want to play around a lot with line of sight. You need to play with smooth collision. You need to play with collision profiles. I would probably just set up, like I said, where the camera, anytime it would interact with any object at the same eye level as it ignores, basically. You don't want to do it with walls, because you typically don't want to have your camera just flying out into the vast expanse of the abyss where you can see the whole outside of your level. But if that's the case, then as a designer or as the person building the project, whoever it is that would be controlling that specific aspect of it, you would really need to play test and find what are the difficult spots of your level where your camera is being forced to either jut in or jitter very abruptly based off of the environment around it. And then go through and adjust accordingly through your profile settings. That's really the easiest and best way of going about that. There's no, I wish that there was just like a straight up easy solution for a lot of these, but there is not, unfortunately. It really just requires playtesting, playtesting, playtesting. And sometimes it's unavoidable. You will get instances of your camera shifting abruptly, and there's just nothing you can do about that, depending on how the actual level itself was built. And in that case, that's where you might need to start playing around with camera settings and doing some of those mitigations to reel in how abrupt and jarring some of those experiences can be. But if that is something someone is really struggling with, like I said, please read more about collision profiles, setting custom collision profiles, setting custom settings. You can rename them. You can assign them to various different assets, so you don't have to make a new profile per asset. In fact, please don't do that. You can repurpose them and use them across all different sorts of things. But that would be the best way of approaching instances like that, where
Because I saw a couple comments of people talking about where cameras zoom in and out really quickly. And that's why. It's because collision. The camera's trying to figure out where it can exist, where it is allowed to exist, which sounds really sad, actually, in retrospect. But we have to set those bounds for it. So if you ever find, especially in small rooms, it might be worth having like a hallway or some kind of extra offshoot of a room where at a specific angle the camera can sit comfortably and the player can see the whole room in its entirety. Or other times you might just realize that the room cannot be the size that you have originally designed it to be and it must be larger. Things like that to consider when going through instances like that. So that was my soapbox for that.
Important though. Important.
Yeah. Like I said, that's kind of its own thing. There's a lot of other documentation, a lot of other resources that go into that and how to set them up that would explain them vastly superior than I could. So do check those out if you have the opportunity to and you feel like it would be helpful for your project. But that is, I think, just about everything that I wanted to hit as far as the general discussion and demos and stuff for now. So what did you want me to get into, Dan? I will throw it back to you.
Sure. There was just a couple little quick tiny things that I wanted to cover real quick here. If we go back over to this, go into your display and show collision. Have it so that it's just showing what the collisions in this world look like.
No.
Okay then. All right, stream's over, everybody. That's
there you go. Yep. That's my answer. No, I won't do that. Here we are.
This kind of lets you see what a lot of collisions are. I actually want to shout out, it was some game dev called this out in chat, and this was something that I wanted to kind of touch on too earlier, which is that if you look around here, you can kind of see what the collisions look like for your area. And in this part where we're looking, there's collision on everything that the player could touch. That's really important. But then now, Tina, if we turn and kind of look down the crevasse, if you will, and we can see all the collision everywhere else too that we don't necessarily need, you could actually start, again, depending on your needs, you could actually start where you have like a basic collision or, whatever is generated automatically in your scene, build it out, start playtesting it, optimize it where you can. So if you have a bunch of things that are really complex, that are just way more complex than they need to, go ahead and reduce those down. If you're having any issues where you can't navigate where you're supposed to, or projectiles are hitting things that they're not supposed to, blah, 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 go through all that process. And then once you're at the very end of the process, you can actually then look out across areas that the player is never going to touch, take those assets, select them, and disable their collision in the engine. So that way they're no longer being calculated in that way. And then again, use like maybe a blocking volume or a couple blocking volumes to then just kind of really simplify that. So if anybody gets cheeky and finds a way that they can bounce across the world and get in areas that they're not supposed to, that they're still blocked. But it allows you to still have those collisions that are nice and complex, quote unquote, for the needs of where the play space is, and then reduce those later after the fact once you're like, all right, we have a perfect play space, everything's smooth, we've optimized it really well, and we have a bunch of objects out here that are never going to be interacted with by the player, they're never going to be interacted with by the AIs or anything like that. We do not need to consider them for any sort of calculation. Let's remove those, create some simple blocking volumes that can, achieve the goal, and then call that and have a much more reduced and simplified and performant scene. It's a very simple trick, and it, again, kind of allows you to work, instead of being like, all right, I need to start as minimal as possible. You can start in a position that's comfortable. Again, be reasonable. Don't go like, all right, everything is complex and everything's a million polygons and things like that. Be reasonable, but then optimize as you go. Because play testing is going to be key. You're going to play test a lot. You're going to iterate a lot and use that play test and iteration process to then reduce the collision for the things in your scene. There you go.
Someone requested Teal World, so I figured
that's where I thought you were going, but honestly, it worked without it.
I just think it's so beautiful. I just wanted to still show off the assets, but.
And Tina kind of showed this off a little bit too in one of the assets. When you go to collision inside the asset editor, there is a bunch of different options there. You can do the simple box, you can do the capsule, the sphere, and things like that. You can also have the engine use certain level of points, either 10 in the X, Y, and Z, 18, 26, or whatever, to try to create its own simplified collision that might actually be more performant than in the example that Tina showed with the voxel. But you are going to be at the whim of this. And again, there's no concave things like that. It's all convex. So it may not work. And in that case, then you would either go into another software to create your own, maybe use the voxel thing, maybe use a, blocking volumes, what do you want to do? But in some cases, you just say, all right, you know what, do a 10x, it does it, and it goes, this is actually completely ideal for what I need. That is a very simple collision, and it works perfectly. Takes 10 seconds, and you're great. Doesn't always work like that, and don't expect it to always work like that. Don't expect it to be like, all right, I'm going to go into thing, I'm just going to hit the 26, on everything and call it done, because in a lot of instances, it's not going to work. But in a lot of instances, it does a good enough job, and you're okay. So try it. If it doesn't work, then adjust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. If we remove...
Now let's see what
this one, this is what the 10x was for that one. But I'm wondering, this one is a little less overhang, so it's fine. It's not bad.
And again, in like a melee action game, that might work just fine. In a platformer, that might work just fine. I would probably try to get it a little bit more round, but that's a great example of play test it. If it works and it can be that simple, great. If it doesn't work, then adjust.
There is also auto, where you can specifically choose how precise, how many verts you want to have in it as well. Again, you're still kind of at the whims, at the mercy of the engine and what it deems appropriate.
But honestly, that's
so it's a little bit closer.
Not bad. I would say at the very bottom, again, if you're doing things like precision arrows in like first person, that sort of thing could be a little bit of a problem. But again, it depends on the use case. That's another fun thing in chat is this is why devs have like absolute monsters of computers, because we will start and we will be horribly unoptimized, and the point is to get something that functions, and then from there we'll make it work on lower end spec machines. Because there's so many variables to account for with something like that. And so being as proactive as possible is really great, but there is an element of proactive where you start making assumptions that then aren't true, and then you're now undoing work. So going in a route where you can get as close to the goal as possible with minimal wasted effort, and then see if it works, because if it works, you're great, and then if it doesn't, then you have to undo. But if you go like, oh, in this instance I'm gonna need exactly this, and you spend all this time and you get in there and it doesn't work, and then you're like, oh well, I just wasted all that time trying to get that very specific thing. So those are the two things I wanted to touch on real quick. So
absolutely. All right, well, I think with that, probably we can just get into the questions for now. What do you think, Dave?
All right, let's do it.
Let's do it. Maybe.
Possibly. Perchance.
Maybe, potentially. Perhaps. We will. I'm trying to pull up the question list. Give me a second, everybody. I'm getting there.
We both picked a bad time to both simultaneously start to read. I should have picked up the slack there. That was my bad.
All right, let's see here. Someone said, I'm excited for this because coincidentally, next month I'll be working on a melee combat system, and I want to know what's the best way / practices to even go about doing that, especially with melee weapons. So if we're just talking straight up about like setting up collision for your environment from, I would argue we're talking mostly about this from the content creation side and less the actual programming side. So there's a lot of things to consider when it goes into the programming side of it as well. But I would just kind of echo what you were saying before, Dan, about finding eyesight, what kind of melee combat are you doing? Are you allowing people to just swing swords like normal? Is there jumping? Is there sliding? Are there abilities where you can go for higher or lower on the person that you are attacking or being attacked by? And all those things are things to take into consideration when it comes to collision, especially with the environment around you. Do you want to have it where if a player is attempting to swing a sword in a tight corridor, for example, that if they're too close to the wall, their sword will bounce off of the wall? Is that something you want to have happen? If so, that is something you can do and you can set up. But these are all, again, things to consider based exclusively off of the project that you're building and the experience that you want your player to have while going into this. I know, especially for melee combat, I think most games anymore tend to not have super enclosed spaces with melee combat for obvious reasons, because it makes it vastly more difficult. But also so that they can avoid having to make decisions like that of, oh, well, do I allow the sword to clip fully through the wall? Do I allow them to cleave stone in one swipe? Or do I now have to put in this extra functionality of, if you're swinging a sword in a closed hallway, your sword might bounce off a wall, buddy. I'm sorry, that's how it works. We're in the real world now. So all things to kind of consider when it comes into those sorts of things. That's more of a design consideration, I guess, than collision necessarily. But
yeah, the collision does aid in the design, though. If this is your first kind of melee combat experience with anything like that, I also recommend looking up some like GDC talks and things like that, because this is true of basically any kind of game, but like games have their own cheats, like in terms of maybe your last 10% of health is really your last 25% of health, but you don't show that to the player. Or maybe the sword's collision actually extends a little bit further than the weapon actually does, just for the sake of making sure that game feel is nice. Maybe a specific part of the collision on the sword is dedicated as this is what detects if it hits walls, and that's a shorter part of the collision, so that way you have a long collision for game feel and then a shorter collision just for detecting in the world, so that way you're not always hitting it on every single thing every single time you try to use your weapon and things like that. So there are tons of little cheats, little details, things like that thankfully we live in an industry that's pretty comfortable with sharing things, which is not true of a lot of industries. And so there's a lot of really great resources online for things like that I absolutely recommend also looking into, because they can give you a lot of ideas for things that you would maybe not have considered. And you might be having issues, 6 months in, where you're just like, man, I can't get this sword combat to feel right. It can oftentimes be down to those simple little tricks that go like, oh, well, now this feels so much better because I'm still having consequences for taking the attack where I knew I wasn't going to be able to hit the person, but also not so much that like you clipped it by like a millimeter and you bounced off of it completely because of it. So things like that.
that's true. That's a good point. I would probably leave it like that because I'm sadistic.
Well, here's the thing: is that is usually the default that game designers will go through, and then they realize like, okay, this either does indeed meet my goal, or it doesn't. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't, because usually you want to lean on like a less punishing, or at least less punishing in a sense that the player feels like it's not their fault. There is a very common argument that you'll hear with people. You'd be like, oh my gosh, that's such, BS. I totally dodged that, or I did not hit that wall, or whatever. Games, I mean, they can lie, but inherently don't lie. They are programs to do calculations. The calculation is that your sword hit that thing, therefore you hit the wall. Their calculation is that you weren't dodging where you thought you were, so you got hit. So adding buffers and things like that maybe inherently make it a little less realistic, but they make it feel better. And that is way more important in game design than realism ever will be. You would be amazed how many devs have so many tricks that are just straight up lying to you. And once you know them, you're like, oh, that kind of cheapens it a little bit, but you don't care at the time because you're having a great time. Like, I want to say it's the original BioShock. The first shot will always miss. Any enemy that shoots you, they will always miss their first shot, which gives you a chance to react. Knowing that, now that I've ruined that for you, I'm sorry, might cheapen that a little bit, but it feels good in the moment because the shot goes off. You're not immediately taking damage by something you didn't even know it's there. It gives you a second to react, but that follow-up shot's probably going to hit you. So you still have to react. You still have to move. You still have to get into cover, or, attack them or zap them or something like that, whatever it is. You still have to do it, but it feels good. So you're not just like, oh, look, there's a thing. I'm just picking up something out of the trash in here. And then you get shot in the back of your head. Like, well, there goes half my health.
Mm-hmm.
Did I ruin it for everybody?
You've ruined it for them.
No. Everybody forget this stream happened.
Erase your memory banks from the last 30 seconds. Yeah, that's a really good point. Let's see.
I may be mixing up the game too, so that could be inaccurate information, but I'm pretty sure it's true.
You're not. You're right. Pretty sure I've heard something like that before.
Yeah, I'm almost positive, but because I'm not completely, I don't want to be like, it definitely is. And somebody's like, no, actually wasn't.
Hello, I'm having issues scaling sizes of my meshes with collision. Is there a way to make the collision mesh stick closer to the mesh once the scale is different from import size? That just comes down to the scale settings in the engine inherently. You can change that up in the top right corner. Let me move everything out of the way.
I was gonna say I finally got a peek behind the curtains on how Tina handles her layout, and it started kind of scary, but she got into a good place after a little bit.
yeah. Don't worry, it's fine. I know what I'm doing. All right. So yeah, if you want to pop over now,
I'll also do it.
Yeah. So the scalability, it's the same setting inside for collisions as well. It's just your snap size is here. If you're talking about when you're creating something new directly in the collision and you're having issues with that, there is a known bug, actually, and that might be what you're referencing. And maybe I shouldn't talk about this, but I'm gonna anyway.
This is the third neuralizer flash we're gonna need to do after this, everybody. So
there is a known bug where if you're in the collision window here, well, it's the static mesh window, but you can adjust your collision here. If you scale things and you change the scalability size, and then you find that you're having issues with your scaling, you need to just close and restart your project, and then it'll work correctly. It's just a thing that happens. It happens occasionally to me too. Like you can see here, I have it set to 0.1, and it is definitely not scaling by 0.1. It's just a bug. Sometimes clicking a different option fixes it. That sort of fixed it, but yeah, it's even happening to me right now. So literally the way that you fix that is you just save everything, close your project, and reopen it, and then it'll start working again. So there you go.
Love it. I want to comment two things in the chat. I came for the knowledge and I leave with a broken heart for BioShock. Sorry. I'm sorry. The other one that I love here is it's 2024. Don't we just set use complex as simple, wipe our browse and call it a hard day's work for the CPU? Done. Only if you want to get extremely yelled at by your engineers. Only if you want to have many a talk. You can absolutely do that.
Listen, if you're a solo dev though, you make the rules. We can't tell you what to do.
We can't. The reviews might. When you need like 3 work machines and a server farm to run your game.
Yeah. I'm not here to make friends. Exactly.
That would be funny though, to just have like in your settings for your game, just have like, low, medium, high, and then just like do not use this one, and just have do not use this one, just give everything the most complex collision and just watch the computer explode.
Okay, let's see here. How would one handle landscape collision, especially when importing custom maps or data from Gaia or other landscape generation softwares? Well, the pros of using a landscape generation software is that most of them, most of them actually do include collision along with your landscape mesh and with your landscape data. So you don't even have to worry about that. So as long as that's included in whatever program it is that you're using, then you're just kind of set to start with. Same with directly in engine as well. If you're using the native landscape tools, there's default collision that gets spawned with the landscape, and it'll adjust based off of how you sculpt it or whatever it is that you're doing with it. Really, generally speaking, I would say don't mess with the landscape collision, because there's so much of it. Condensing it down is really a task in and of itself. I think if you're having issues with performance because of it, then my recommendation is to simplify your actual landscape itself and then add the complexity of your environment back in through environmental props like rocks that you can stack together, or buildings, or adding in all these other assets with simplified collision. And that'll help with your performance overall. And that also kind of gives you a little bit more control of how exactly you could make your landscape look and feel. Just keep that base landscape with the most simplified version of itself as you can, and then make up for the difference with props and assets.
Yeah, the landscape tool is pretty meticulously optimized. So unless, like Tina said, you have like a crazy dense terrain, there's probably other optimizations that are really causing it, like problems, more than the landscape is in most cases. But I'm sure there's always a fringe case where that's not true, but it's pretty well optimized. So
yeah, usually speaking, I think the only time where really it could potentially become a problem is if you're using like one-to-one geographical data, but I wouldn't recommend doing that. That's where I was saying, like, I would use the simplified version of that data and then compensate for the level of realism that you're looking for, either through PCG placement of assets or
tessellation
manually,
and things like that.
I mean, if you really want, yeah, or tessellation. I'm getting an issue where 2 thin cylindrical physics objects, when moving fast, sometimes pass through each other when they should collide instead. How to solve that? That's such a specific use case. I unfortunately don't know if we can actually fix that necessarily right now.
Usually
when
it's
moving fast specifically.
Usually it's going to depend on tick. So oftentimes when that happens, and this might not be true in this case, this is conjecture.
Like, we need to see the project to really tell you exactly, but yeah, go.
But usually what's happening is a calculation happens. The engine, I'm going to try to put this in the engine knows where things are, and then it does a calculation, and then depending on where those objects are, they're either going to hit each other, the engine is going to know that and then tick and say, hey, this collided, or it's going to be like, all right, they're here, and then the next tick they're like this, so they have now gone through each other and they're not actually detecting. So my assumption is that it's going to be based off of your tick rate and how fast the objects are going, and you might have to do some additional coding trickery to try to work around that, but that's usually the problem. I know that, like, especially on like low frame rate games, and it's a very common way of like clipping through walls and things like that, because the game is doing a calculation, you're at the wall, it's doing the next calculation, you have moved this far, well, you're not at the wall, you're now through it, and then you just go through. So that's usually the problem.
Yep. I do want to do a bit of a call out from chat here, because I think it's someone over on YouTube chat. In Twitch chat, they have some answers for you. So I will be the middleman for you. They're asking you to try increasing your substepping in your physics. So give that a go and see how that goes. Look at this. Community is reaching out to each other.
My favorite one
the void.
My favorite one that happens is sometimes you'll say that we're like, oh, this from Twitch chat, and then like YouTube would be like, this is going to Twitch. Like they don't even know that each other exist.
But yeah, give some of those options a try and see how it goes for you. Is there a way to have multiple sets of collision for a single mesh so part of it can block a specific channel and let the rest ignore it? Yeah, you can apply several different kinds of collision to a single mesh. That's kind of what I was saying before, where even like you can have your animation IK interact with the same object but a different version of the collision of that object. You can do that through assigning different channels, assigning different profiles that do different things. Even if you have just different collision sections, like you could have two box collisions, simple box collisions, for example, and set different parameters for each one. So that is definitely possible. A lot of that requires messing with the blueprints, of course, with the blueprint, or sometimes it's easier just to set it up directly through programming as well. But it is possible.
Yes.
Is the short answer. Trying to find some good ones that we can answer in the time that we got left.
You're good. I was gonna say something, but I feel like that would actually just be more distracting.
No, do it. Go ahead. What are you gonna say?
Oh no, hi Tina, how are you? I like your shirt, jacket.
Peer pressure into talking. Thank you. I made both of them. All right, let's
really
see. Yeah.
Oh dang.
How would you deal with collision on simulated stuff like capes, loose clothing, or hair? I'm always unsure if I would rather use cloth simulation for that stuff or using some sort of proxy or rig it. You have asked, I should say, a question that I think all of us have asked at one point in our journey, and we'll probably continue to ask continually throughout, because it very much depends on, I feel like I've said this a million times, and it's going to start sounding like a cop-out answer as well, but it's not. But it heavily depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve. Like, if you're talking capes of, like, Helldivers 2 level, with that level of majesty, right? That's going to be very different from any kind of physics or simulation that you would apply to a cape from... I don't want to name another one because it's going to sound like I'm roasting them, but I'm not. But a cape that has less
quality game here.
Yeah, like a cape that has a little less majesty but is still beautiful. Those are handled in completely different systems and ways. So my first suggestion is to find an example of what exactly you're trying to mimic, and then go from there, because cloth simulation is fantastic for stuff that is extremely complicated or really, really like small nuanced movement. But if you just want something that has simplified physics or just reacts to the simple armor underneath it or something like that, you could easily do that just through a rig and through animation. So it depends on what you're trying to do. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Dan.
I mean, yeah, I'm kind of just echoing it. I mean, if it were me, and this is purely speaking from my own position, so take it with like a tablespoon of salt, I would probably try going the easier route first with just like some simple like cloth physics in engine. And then if that is not giving me the result that I want, then go in and start custom rigging controls into it, so that way I absolutely get the result that I want. But it really, again, just depends on the situation. In some instances, the simple cloth works beautifully. In other instances, there's some specifics in terms of length and the geometry of the character that it's on and how its collision model is working with it. They can cause some finicky things that you might want to work out. But I mean, that's just how I would do it. I don't know. Is that terrible advice? Neuralizer, go.
Awful advice. No, it was fine. It was great. Okay. I'm trying to find one good last question here before we wrap up for today. There's a few more on here, and I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to go through them all. It's because we talk a lot. That's the truth of the matter. There's many questions that I myself have answered that could have been a little more succinct than they were, and I apologize. But
I was gonna say, you said we, but it really sounded like you said Dan. And so that's how
I feel like I'm the instigator in this case.
I don't know. I think the last two tangents were completely my fault. So,
is it possible to customize or even swap the collision capsule shape at runtime? For example, my character tends to look through the walls when they kneel. That is so fair. There probably is. The short TLDR version of this answer is there probably is. The longer version is, even if there is, I don't know if I would recommend that for the instance that you're specifically talking about, or if there's a problem with just a specific animation, part of your character is clipping through the environment or whatever, what have you. That sounds more like an issue with the animation, right? And less with the collision of the environment around you. Because if every time your character kneels, their head is clipping through whatever cover it is in front of them, that problem is going to persist no matter what they're standing next to or are behind, right? So I'd recommend going back to the original animation file itself and seeing if there's not something that you can adjust there. Because that, to me, sounds like the lesser version of work than trying to adjust the collision at runtime to compensate for something like that.
Yeah, like Tina said, it's probably just the instance of your capsule, wherever your character is supposed to be in. When they crouch, they are sticking out so far from that point so that when they touch the wall, the camera's actually going through the geometry. So you might need to just change the position or even add a buffer to how large the capsule is at that point, or animation. There's a bunch of different ways that you can handle that just to kind of avoid it from actually clipping through.
Yeah.
And if you said it's your camera's going through, I'm assuming it's probably a first person sort of situation. If that's true, and there's an asterisk here if it's a multiplayer game and things like that, you can do some really janky stuff in a first person solo game where like that character's like crouches and then is like really contorted back that actually makes no sense and looks horrible, but it fits for the game. If that's the case, simple solution with something like that. But there's many different ways it can hit.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, with that, I think we're gonna stop it with questions there for now, just because otherwise Dan and I are gonna keep going for another 3 hours. And you think I'm joking, but I'm not. So Thank you all so much for coming and hanging out today. Again, my apologies for the very last minute kind of change in the plans, especially I know some of you were really excited to have that animation stream. Like I said before, that is still happening. So don't feel like it has been canceled and you're never going to get that content. You are. It just, unfortunately, things happen. This is real life. We want to make sure that our guests are comfortable and feel good being able to be there and talk about things. So we're just adjusting the date for that. It will be happening sometime near late August. I'll let you know when we have a more specific date for that. And a quick little sneak peek at some of the other streams we've got lined up. We're going to be talking very soon, very soon, about the pros and cons of using blueprints versus manual coding. So blueprints versus manual code C++, things like that. Other ways also of how to translate concepts that you might know from other kinds of programming languages like C#, Python, so on and so forth, over into the C++ space, and how you can also attach some of those same concepts directly to blueprints itself. So that one's going to be really exciting. I'm really personally looking forward to that one. So.
Selfishly speaking, as someone who is much better at the art side than I am the programming side, that is going to be,
yeah,
I just want to see that for me.
Yeah.
That's completely selfishly.
Yeah, it's going to be good. So keep an eye out for the blueprints one. The animation updates is going to be happening. There's also something in the works for some UI. So anyone who's interested in learning more about UI, keep an eye out for that as well. Lots of good stuff in the pipeline, basically. But thanks for hanging out today. Hopefully you learned something interesting about collision that can help you with your project or your projects moving forward. And if it's stuff you already knew, maybe it was the push you needed to go and do that collision work that you've been thinking about and that you've been like, I'll get to it later, but maybe you should do it now. This is your sign.
If you can't say that you were proud and confident of your collision work, then you need to go back and make some adjustments.
There
you should be proud.
So much behind that. Yeah.
You
There's
should
so
be
much feeling
confident and be like, you guys should look at my collisions. Take 100 devs, put them in this room, and I did it the best.
Look at my teal world and cry.
Nothing less.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, so thank you once again, everybody, for coming and hanging out today. Thank you so much, Dan, for coming on to be my impromptu guest for the day. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
And thank you all one last time for coming and watching. The show wouldn't be what it is without you and your participation and your questions, and also the cool moments like what happened earlier where we get to get YouTube and Twitch helping each other out. That was sick. I liked that.
Love it.
So keep an eye out. We'll be back again next week with even more cool Unreal Engine stuff for you to learn and do and experience and all the other adjectives that can be applied to this sentence that I'm trying to extend on for some reason. If you missed any part of the stream earlier, no worries. We post, I am talking so much with my hand, but that's okay. We post all of our streams in video format that can be viewed on demand on both our Twitch and YouTube channel at Unreal Engine. So if you missed any part of it, no worries. You can go back, watch it at your leisure, get all the information that you need to. And you can also find all of our other streams that we've done as well. We keep all of them in a nice little playlist right on YouTube there for you to go check out and get any other topics that you might be interested from there. If you're interested in learning more about our most relevant news or keeping up with us and our updates, you can do so on all of our socials at Unreal Engine, or you could pop on over to the Epic developer community, which is just, our sick hub with our forums and our documentation and our both community and Epic staff created tutorials and learning paths. There is so much stuff there, especially if you're new or if you're really in the trenches learning some really deeply advanced stuff. You should be able to find help to some degree or inspiration over there.
I might also suggest, if you're still in here, the person who is having that question with the things going through each other and not working, forums would be a great place to post that question, because there are a lot of people way smarter than I am in that area that can probably help you out. So definitely consider doing that.
Yes. So go check out the EDC. There really is a ton of stuff there, especially now that documentation has been moved over. It really is kind of your one stop hub of all Unreal Engine things you should conceivably need. But yes, there is also a Discord as well. If you're a fan of Discord, there is a public Discord. It's not owned by Epic, but there's a lot of us that hang out there, and also tons of other developers that are incredibly knowledgeable. So if that's your thing, go check out Unreal Slackers. I think it might be Unreal Source now. Let me check. Yeah, it looks. I think it's Source now. Got updated too. But that's also
Old
just a
habits
wonderful
die hard.
community in and of itself. So go hang out there too. Highly recommend. All right. Any last words, Dan? Wasn't supposed to be that ominous, but as it was coming out my mouth, I was like, well, we're leading into it now.
No, I think that my very stern talking just a few moments ago is
your last words.
Is my last words.
All right, perfect. My last words are going to be, have a fantastic weekend, everybody, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Sorry.